I'm currently not at home today. I am in Berlin. We have a beautiful weather in Berlin today. We're always very thankful when we have nice weather this late into October. And of course, you always have beautiful weather in Nairobi, don't you, Ati?
Well, we try.
Great. Of course, thank you very much, Ati, for being the better half of this live stream today. Perhaps if maybe we can go ahead and get started in introducing our illustrious panelists.
Super. Thanks, Mike. So I'm going to go from right to left. So today we have from the city of Philadelphia, Emily Yates, who's the Smart City Director, Innovation Management in the Office of Innovation and Technology. And then we have Richard James McCowan, who's the founder of the Mimicry Innovation Lab and a biofuturist. And after that, we have Dr. Anita Patil Deshmukh, who's calling in from Bombay or Mumbai. And she's the executive director at Pukar. And I also have my co-host, Michael Boyle, Mike, and myself, Arti. So I'm now going to turn over. Oh, before I do, I'm going to thank everybody who has donated today towards Pukar. And we'll tell you towards the end about who Pukar is. And I'm sure Anita will be talking about it anyway. But yes, let's start. I think I'm going to kick off with the first question for all our panelists. Emily, welcome.
Thank you. How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
Doing well.
Good. So my question to you is, how did you get committed to this thing called urban regeneration or circular economy? And, what was the magic moment for you? Tell us.
It's very clear in my mind, so I'm happy to share with you. It was pretty much a catalytic point in my career. I worked for a international think tank called the German Marshall Fund, and my focus was on exchanging transatlantic urban policies, public policies, between cities in Europe and cities in the US. And we focused mostly on working with cities within the Rust Belt. So for those of you not familiar, those are all the cities where steel and kind of iron and metals were produced, and then there was a collapse of the economy, and those cities kind of fell into a state of kind of missing an economy and needing workforce development and whatnot. And so those are like Cleveland, Detroit, Pittsburgh, Buffalo, kind of that area is deemed the Rust Belt. And so our focus was on sustainable and livable policies. And I happened to be taking a study tour of folks from, I was supposed to be Detroit, but it ended up being Pittsburgh and Charlotte to replace the Detroit stakeholders, and Torino, Italy. It was an exchange between Detroit and Torino originally to look at the energy economy of Amsterdam. And so I organized this study tour, and I came upon this place called De Kovel in North Amsterdam that was doing innovative things around energy collection, and just was a regenerative site in terms of it was a former brownfield. It had been redeveloped from a grassroots level and whatnot. And so we went there one day, and it was just eye-opening how this small site had really activated what had been a former kind of industrial space and brought people to the community, had connected them to the community through work and volunteer efforts, and really just created energy in a formerly derelict place. If any of you guys ever go to Amsterdam, I would encourage you to go check it out. But it's basically old houseboats that were going to be sent to the landfill. They brought onto site and retrofitted them to become workspaces that you can rent out. They have a cafe there. It's a living lab to test urban circular economy principles. So they were using plants to address the state of the soil. They're doing hydroponics to grow food for the cafe. It was very much a closed loop systems effect. And so I saw that as an opportunity to improve what was happening in Cleveland and in Pittsburgh and in Charlotte, and these areas that really needed help improving the quality of life for the residents. And from there, I just dove fully into circular economy and saw my opportunity to really help apply that principle as a planning paradigm in cities in the US. And so I've been working since then to apply it to cities and hopefully move them forward.
So I have to say, I love the idea of how sort of, water and living on water and how adapting some of those ideas from a city of 800,000 people, which is what Amsterdam is, to big cities in the US or indeed anywhere else around the world. I think that's a fantastic idea. So thanks, Emily. I'm going to hand over to Mike.
Okay, great. And so let's go ahead and bring on Richard to the stage. Richard, first of all, again, thank you very much for joining us today. And I know that you have clearly a monumental story to tell us about that tipping point for you and what actually got you involved with this subject that we feel so passionate about.
Yeah, I've kind of always been interested in kind of complex systems. So I've got a picture here of where I used to spend my summers, and this is up in the Highlands of Scotland. And it doesn't often look like this. If anyone's ever been there, that's kind of a snapshot in time that you rarely see, or you're getting attacked by millions of midges, which are really, really small mosquitoes that come at you. And I was interested in talk about from my grandparents about the value, how everything is connected together and cause and effect, and how things change. I actually ended up in the real estate market, real estate development and finance. And through getting made redundant in 2008, the economic crash, I actually worked a bit for a company doing stuff in Denmark and Finland, and then retraining urban landscape design. And through that, it was kind of things started clicking about, again, more in the landscape led of landscape urbanism, of the value of building in these systems, especially the natural systems, into kind of industrial symbiosis, which led into circular economy and biomimicry. And for those of you who don't know what biomimicry is, it's about how do we look at how nature solves problems and transfer them into our technologies, or emulating those sort of bases of building into bigger projects for, flood attenuation or soil management, these kind of things. So it's kind of led me into that, and I work across areas from into the circular economy, although to me the circular economy is kind of a utopia to reach for, because we can cover this later. It's about, there's no such thing as zero waste, and nature's about minimizing it. It's just low entropy. Well, I've been interested in kind of this thing of how do we minimize the waste in buildings and bigger developments in cities as well. I've not actually been to Amsterdam yet, but going to various other places in the Netherlands and understanding how they're looking at reusing materials kind of got me there. And even going back to kind of the garden city mentality and the town planning association in the UK. So for me, it's about, I'm constantly learning from not only looking at the natural world, but also picking up things from little stories people are telling me about some of the projects we're doing in Africa, or projects we're looking at setting up in India, and just speaking to people, just understanding how people work on the ground, and actually understanding the human-centered approaches, because everywhere is kind of unique, and we can't just take this top-down view. So this is how I've kind of got into these myriad of areas. So thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Well, then thank you very much for that, Richard. And I will go ahead and hand the stage back over to Ati, who will be talking to Anita.
Good evening, Anita. Lovely to have you on. I mean, you've just heard about Emily's and Richard's aha moments around sort of regenerating, of urban centres, and you happen to live in a city which has the population of a country like the Netherlands, right? We've just been talking about Amsterdam. So can you tell us about your story? What led you to this idea of empowering and uplifting people in such a complex environment like Bombay?
So first of all, thank you very much for this opportunity. It gives me great joy to connect with you all, and probably connect with all the audience which is present. So I love that. Thank you. I have a fairly checkered story, which people are going to find more than amusing. So I'm actually a United States trained neonatologist, which means I worked in the intensive care unit for premature babies in United States at an academic center for 25 years. And I was also director of my residency program, which means I had 36 young doctors to be trained to be either pediatricians or neonatologists. So that was my way of putting food on the table. But while I was doing that, I did two separate things. I volunteered for a organization. It's a quite a pioneering organization in Chicago called India Development Service. We used to support small scale rural developmental projects across the country. So I used to come to India every January, skipping the Chicago wretched cold, because January is always horrible in Chicago. And then I would visit various states of India where our projects were located. So over 15 years of my voluntary tenure with IDS, while I continued my full-fledged job as a academic neonatologist faculty, I visited India 15 times, visited about 12 states, 44 projects. And I think a lot of my education in development happened through those visits. So that was a very pulling point for me. But the other thing which was very important, which I think the people in audience need to know, that I went to a medical school which was subsidized by the government of India. That meant that my parents paid barely 10% of my fees. The rest 90% were paid by government, which is paid by the people who paid taxes. I mean, government gets the money only from people, at least in India. So I knew that the people who actually made me doctor were not my parents, but the people of my country. And I always had a sense of debt on my mind that I ultimately need to do something for my country's people who made me a doctor. So while I always thought of, coming back, I also, during my tenure in Chicago, there were 3 organizations which I supported wholeheartedly every single year, which were Amnesty, Greenpeace, and Doctors Without Borders. And I think especially Amnesty and Greenpeace, I literally feel that they came into existence just around the time that I reached America, and they grew big in front of my eyes. And the amount of public connectivity they did, especially Amnesty and Greenpeace, it was amazing. And the amount of community people supported that with small donations, because both these organizations did not receive big money from any funders like Rockefellers or Fords or stuff like that. Most of their funding came from small community people. So that was a model which I think I liked. And then in 2004, I gave up clinical medicine. I went to Harvard. I got a degree in public health. And then I spent 6 months in Kennedy School learning about urban development. And then I relocated to India in 2005 and took up Pukar, which is a organization which essentially works with marginalized youth located in marginalized communities. And we empower them with research skills, with employability skills, with knowledge producing skills, so that they become the game changers in their communities through social, political, and economic changes. So that's my rather long story. Thank you, Aarti.
Thank you very much. And I'm really starting to sense some sort of common threads across the different conversations. Certainly one thing that has struck me so far is so much grassroots level work. It's not, we're not talking about mayors or governors of cities that have this amazing top-down plan which suddenly improves the lives of every citizen and provides energy and sanitation and transport and the rest. But Mike, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think that one of the messages that I heard quite clearly, especially coming from Anita, is this question of empowerment, that she felt empowered because of those that actually went ahead and supported her with her degree. And I think a question of sense of responsibility. Now, if we're looking to go ahead and change the way that we are managing things, especially within an urban environment. I would like to ask the panelists maybe if they can give us an idea specifically tied to this question of empowerment. Perhaps, Emily, if we can go ahead and start with you. How much do you think empowerment plays a role in that of us being able to accomplish our goals?
Good question. I think in order to achieve the systems change that we need to have to meet climate targets, to ensure that everybody, to meet the SDGs, I think we need empowerment's critical. I think we need a top-down, bottom-up approach. I think everybody has a role to play. And I think it's especially important to empower the individuals that don't feel empowered. So I think Anita's work is amazing, that what she's doing. But I think, yeah, that it's like, I mean, I could talk for hours on this, so I'm trying to be somewhat succinct, but I think that that's part of the problem that we experience in cities, is that we forget about empowering the unempowered and bringing them into the conversation and giving them a seat at the table, and having their perspectives, their thoughts, their feedback as critical in the whole process. And so if we don't empower, we won't be successful.
So one of the things I just wanted to ask, and because we were talking about this earlier, and I think it would be great to expand on it, Emily, is this whole idea of, putting paper over the cracks. And so, the top-down approach is very much, well, we're seeing this symptom. It could be violence, and rather than sort of trying to find that root cause, we sort of tend to try and look at the symptom. Can you talk a bit more about that? And then I'd love to hear from the others.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're in the state we are in as a global, as the planet, as a city, as a state, because we put these Band-Aids on things. And, what we were discussing is that there are a lot of reasons for doing this, right? The big challenge we have in the city of Philadelphia is that we've not been able to pivot from being responsive to being proactive. And I think systems change requires some level of being proactive. We have to deal with the politics, right? How do you sustain things is often a question we have on projects beyond the mayoral term, especially if there's a term limit or the city council limits. And I think that requires this grassroots empowerment level to help sustain as we're dealing with the turbulence of politics and elections and whatnot. I think also it requires us to, the short-term fixes are really easy because you can say, well, see, I fixed it. I have results here, but they're not addressing systems change at the root of the cause. And we have, for example, here in Philadelphia, we have a slight crime issue right now. A lot of cities are experiencing an increase in crime. I would say it could potentially be at crisis level here in Philadelphia regarding homicides and violence. And a large part of that, I think, is lack of opportunities for good jobs, quality of housing, quality of built environment. We did a project in the smart city space where we gathered microscale urban data. So looking block by block, very granular data at the quality of the built environment. We did some comparative analysis, but the goal would be to address homicide and violence, because we know that there's been tons of studies around the quality of the built environment and its impact on reduction of homicides and violence, as well as the benefit of other things, right? It's reducing urban heat island. It could reduce urban flooding. It could impact health comorbidities that a lot of these lower income communities have in our city. And the conversation around violence has been largely about arming our police officers with things like tasers so that they can address mental health issues and not shoot people, but rather take them into custody. Whereas we could have a great conversation about systems change and look at the root cause, which is the quality of the built environment and the quality of life of these individuals, and improve it by things like greening vacant properties, putting trees, widening sidewalks, removing broken windows. But nobody wants to have that conversation because it's a longer term result and it's not an immediate. So instead, they can just say, well, we bought $14 million worth of tasers, which was in the news today. And that will help solve our crime problem. So I think it's really about kind of looking at the symptoms and getting getting people to do that, but it's a really hard thing to do.
Maybe if I can go ahead and pose a follow-up question to Richard. Richard, inquiring minds want to know, does nature work with Band-Aids?
No, it doesn't really work with sticking plasters or.
Oops. Oh, sorry about that, Richard. That was not intentional.
Oh, did you press the
We
wrong
are live.
button?
Yes.
There we go. Well done, Mike. Yeah, we're sorted now. Yeah, it's about understanding the bigger system, and actually the changes you make here will impact all the way through. There's an interesting cartoon I just saw on LinkedIn today, and it was actually, I just shared it with one of the attendees if Romy's on it, and it's the carbon tunnel vision, and we are so focused on carbon emissions, ignoring everything else around education, health, inequality, all these things that tie down. So we're thinking about inequality and tying down, actually, there's a lot more carbon emissions coming from people who are poor. They're living in substandard accommodation. It ties on very much into what Emily was saying as well. One of the things I'm always interested in is kind of behavioral approach. How do you empower people and don't belittle them? You know, we don't need to tell people, oh, you must do this and that and whatever to educate them about the next level, changing the way they live and work. You know, it's about, can we reward them for little, gamifying neighbours against each other. You know, there's a great project that was done in Leeds, and it was called Front to Back Gardens. And the idea there was just to get people out communicating with their neighbours, and they were working with landscape architects to actually use old clothing, old bottles, old pallets to make growing places for food, and then they could share it around. And now that doesn't take a lot of money, and it can then show, and that has all these other knock-on benefits as well into the health and education as well. So I think we can start doing these little things. And Emily touched onto something interesting there. It's just come out from years from a brilliant chap called Peter Head, who's been pushing a lot. It's the missing middle. It's where the top down meets the bottom up, and we can actually get them talking to each other. So you don't just have the activists and you don't have government intervention. You both need to know that you're both making a difference, because that short-sightedness that I think it was Anita brought up about, the 4-year cycle, 5-year election cycles, unless you live in a democracy like Russia, things don't get happening. So we need to start thinking, how can we let the governments and the cities push for these bigger things, but seeing if there's any spare to actually do the smaller things as well.
That was not a paid announcement coming from Richard, just to make sure that everything was clear. Speaking of empowerment, we would like to make sure that everybody understands that we need your comments to make this one meaningful for us. So please feel empowered to go ahead and put your questions into the chat box, because our goal is to make the session as interactive as possible. So we need you to go ahead and participate with that. So that would be my call to action to all of you. I think if we can perhaps maybe create an environment where you all feel empowered as well to go ahead and comment on those things that are being mentioned by each other. Perhaps Anita, maybe you might have some comments as to what Emily and Richard have talked about.
I think what Emily talked about as far as bringing the communities to the table, hearing their voices, resonated very deeply with my work, because that's what we have been trying to do. Because I live in a city where close to 60 to 65% of people live in slums. And living in slum, at least in India, means you don't have legal access to water, sanitation, energy, usually lack of healthcare system nearby and schools. Forget about playgrounds and trees, because the density in slums is so huge. So if I have to give you an example, all these 60% of the people in the city of Mumbai live on 0.08% of the total land. So you can imagine the density. And in one small room, which about is 100 square feet, usually the people living in that place will be 4.6 to 5 people. So imagine the density of people. So these are the people who are not heard, not seen. Although most of these people are migrants, both interstate migrant and within the country migrant, and they are the ones who actually not only build the city and contribute to the economy, in the real sense, they actually build our lives. But to us, to the majority of the people, they are not visible. So we are trying very hard to, like both of them said, that there has to be some system change. Now, system change must happen at the policy level, but I think system change can also happen if people start demanding. So what we're trying to do is to create that demand from people that this is their right and this is what they need to get. And we have used something like mapping very effectively to make poor people understand what are the assets they have and what are the assets they don't have. And then they can take all that data to the policymakers to say, hey, what you are telling us is not what we actually have. And that gives them a greater negotiating power. But the empowerment usually comes from the knowledge created by the community at the community level with the community people. It's an indigenous knowledge that we respect a lot. We believe that kind of a knowledge can contribute considerably to things like sustainable development goals. So that's what we're trying to work with and work at.
Okay. Any thoughts from you, Richard or Emily, on that? I remember seeing an article from you. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Richard. Apologies.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I've been really fascinated, and actually ties very much into Anita's work, is by one of our alma maters, and they set up the Planetary Health Alliance. And I've been delving through. So if anyone goes onto their website, just search in Google, or I don't know, ask Jeeves if it's still around. And and it's about the intrinsic link by our health and planetary health, but things like stuff that Emily was talking about by poverty and heat island effect, or access to childcare and reproductive rates, or family there's a whole host of things in there, and it's very, very interesting to understand that especially in different parts of the world, these intrinsic connections that you're finding between things that you would never have actually thought about like the pricing of certain fruits and vegetables for maybe the higher class of people that actually has a knock-on effect further down the system as well. And I think that's very, very important to actually understand, is we are, as a global populace, our GDP is rising, but our access to nature's destroying and our quality of life, and that's going to have a massive. Well, we're past the tipping point. 3:30 p.m. Let's go. Sorry, that's my Google telling me to go for a walk. It's my smart city at home. So yeah, it's about understanding all these things and how can we then map it out, and is it using data? Problem is the next thing. This can maybe go into some of the things that Emily works on. How do we access quality data? Because I know from a project we're doing in Cape Town, we bid for grants and we were put up against some people from the city, and they said we've got really high quality urban data. Yet the fact that one of our colleagues who actually did his master's project on the lack of quality data in Cape Town, because it's not just dumping lots of data on a website saying there you go. It's actually making sure it can be used without having to spend a fortune on data analytics.
No, sorry.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Emily. I was laughing because that's a conversation we have constantly here in the city of Philadelphia. We have a ton of data, but what defines good data, and who thinks it? So it's an interesting discussion, and I think what we've come to is one, technology can help get good data, right? Whereas we have a lot of data provided by people walking the streets, like a litter index, saying, and I think the street out of 4 rates at 4 because there's litter, but somebody else might say at 3. And so that really kind of messes up the data. But the other part that we've had a lot of success around is that bringing the community in to co-create the data or to affirm the data as part of the empowerment, right? So going back to the example of crime and violence and this microscale data at the block level, which is really granular and great, but it's not my lived experience. It's not my community. So part of what we want to do is go to the community and say, we pulled this data out of images using AI and visual machine learning, but is it correct? Are we missing anything? Is there something that we didn't capture in the process? And I think that that's a really key part of making good data, is also having the community and these people, like Anita was talking about, where she had the mapping exercise and getting them to map out that data about their life. I think that's a really key part in the data space that's often overlooked, largely because we all feel this rush to innovate and to improve on our communities. And the very antithesis to innovation and speed is engaging the community, because it's not a fast process. And so I think that is something that's really come into the data space lately in terms of this urban regeneration.
So what, Emily, you were just saying is exactly. I mean, I agree with everything you have said, that data which is actually created by the community itself can be very granular. If we paratroop on the communities, people are not going to get sensitive information to us because we are outsiders.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea in Pokar is to train the youth who is located in the community itself to collect the data, to do the interviews, to do the focus group discussion. So every single instrument of research and data collection has specifically taught to the youth themselves. And one of the advantages is, in a slum, most of my colleagues actually are slum dwellers who work with me. The issue becomes, okay, I am the woman who is living in the slum. And the person who is coming to ask the data or information from me is a guy whom I see every day standing in the water line, or standing in the line for toilet, or so we share the same problems.
Mm-hmm.
And once I know that this guy, this Bali, is having the same issues that I have, my ability to share my personal sensitive information is much more than sharing it with somebody who is coming from somewhere whom I have never seen, never met, and looks and feels and acts so different. So
100%.
this is one of the very important instrument we have used. And I think I saw a question somewhere that how do you empower? How does empowerment work? So this is how it actually works. So when we have empowered the local youth, and I'll tell you a very important story. So we had a group of youth who were living in a slum, of course, where there was a huge problem with water. I mean, water is a global problem as far as slums are concerned. So it's not just India. So they actually collected the community data and they took it to the local corporator. The corporators, hummed and hawed, and then nothing happened. What they did was they took this particular data and took it to people who actually launched a public interest litigation suit. Now, this case went on for about good 3-4 years. Finally, about 4 years ago, the High Court of Mumbai gave an order that people who live in slums, whether they are legal or illegal, whether the slums are recognized or unrecognized, doesn't matter what, as long as they're living there, every single person will get 50 liters per head per day of water, which is what WHO recommends. That order ultimately came based on all this data collected by this youth living in the slums. This to us was a true empowerment because they actually helped change the policy.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the execution of the policy is still not really complete. So even after 4 years, does every slum in Mumbai receiving water? The answer is no. But has the process started? Yes, it has. Now, it may take another 10 years before it gets completed. So execution of policy is another story. We can have another webinar on it. But right now to say, and I'm sure, Emily, you face this all the time. But at least this is what the data collected by community can certainly do.
Mm-hmm.
And I have many such stories where community youth actually brought changes through their own sense of empowerment. They were small changes, but they're important. So
yeah, and this ties into participatory design done in the right way. It's not about giving them a blank canvas. It's about saying this is exactly what you said. Here's the data. This is what we think. give us our feedback. Then you come back, you make some options. And, you know, I used to work for a company and we did option analysis based on Nobel Prize for Economics. And you give people choices, and then you can find out a fingerprint for individual people by, say, 50 questions. It's multiple cards. By doing that, you understand how individuals react to spaces, what they need. It's understanding their needs, because one of the biggest things I've found is you do these community events to showcase a new development, and it's generally older people that go along who are wanting free teas and coffees. Maybe that's just in the UK. And it's actually the younger people who will be using it for the next 50, 60, 100 years that you need to understand that, you know, yes, you can get away. And I've done this with schools before where they want helicopters and giant water slides. Yes, that's unfeasible, but it's about understanding what lies underneath that. Do they want play? Do they want science? Do they want, you know, silence? Do they want solitude? Do you want places to sit and watch things? And you can actually start building these together, because it answers Elsa's question there about taking the, you know, scaling up to an entire city. I think you've got to start breaking it down into kind of city blocks and city, and then city kind of overlapping kind of districts as well, and looking at actually not just them, but how do they overlap? What are the fuzzy boundaries between these two, or the ecotones, and understanding the interactions, because you can't just plan an entire city unless you're doing that in somewhere like Saudi Arabia, because even then you need these emergent properties. And I think a lot of it will become down at when you go down to the street level of how people use shops. Where do they put their bikes? How do they cross the road? You know, you can't just be dictated to, because that doesn't really work.
No, I mean, I think I always look for those low-hanging fruits, right? That give you some success. Like Anita was talking about, small, but impactful because people feel empowered. And I think it's similar to that, right? You can't plan a whole city because each neighborhood is dynamic and different and has a different cultural component to it potentially. So it's really about kind of that scale, but keeping a broader strategy in place in my mind. But I think also there's the question of who empowers who. And that's like a fine dance in my mind. I think it depends on the community you're engaging with. But generally speaking, my approach has always been, you know, to Nita's point, I don't look like every community that I have to go into and work with. And so we really rely on the local groups, the faith-based organizations that have built these trustful relationships. We work to empower them, to help them empower the community. And then we step out of the way. This is their neighborhood. I'm not living there. Yes. I'm going to use my privilege and my position in whatever way I can to continue to empower them from behind. But the goal is that if we want it to be sustainable and we want it to last for a long time and to have the impact desired, they have to buy into it. They have to be the ones that sustain it. They have to be the ones that are vocal about it. And I think that that's often something that's really a challenge as well for people, is to realize, like, where do you step back and let it kind of run its full course, and where do you kind of step in constantly? But I think that's the critical component that's always a little bit of a dance, is that role.
Emily, what you just said, it's so, I mean, it is on the dot, because I think we really always need to be at the backstage. The actors who are on the front stage cannot be us. And that's what we need to do. We need to use our own knowledge and everything else to empower the community people, or the youth. At least we deal with youth, because they usually have enthusiasm, vision, they are ready to innovate, they're willing to take the risk, which most other people, older people, are not willing to. But, you know, so once we empower them with the knowledge and the capacities and capabilities, we are not in the picture. So it is comparatively, it is easier. I'm not saying it is all that, but easier. The other thing I wanted to just talk about was the issue that Mike got about, is about inequality. I think it's a very critical issue in the cities and urban development issues, that this inequality actually has played havoc everywhere when we are looking at developmental issues. And people have started feeling this sense of inequality, which is actually also giving rise to a lot of violence at every stage. I mean, the violence is not just physical violence, but there is political violence, there is economic violence, there is emotional violence. And all of that, to a certain degree, is coming out of this sense of inequality and sense of being excluded, a sense of being not being included in everything. So I think both of you touched on those points, which are very important for us to know.
I like Andrew's questions there about Indigenous knowledge. I mean, I was always taught, and I still do, is go and look at the maps, going as far back as possible to look at, example being project I was doing down on the Thames estuary, how the immigrants from the Netherlands actually built the waterways and how did they cultivate the land. Can you actually learn from that what's still there, how they built dikes and how they used the inherently fertile lands around where the sediment was deposited on in the Thames, and then also looking at the built structure as well. And I live in a city, York in the UK, and my house is 170 years old, and you start looking around, what's been there, what's still working now, and then you look at new developments. So there was a new development in our city centre, and it just didn't work because the scale wasn't right compared to the buildings, and the building block just didn't feel. And that wasn't because you could get on Google satellite view. It was about you could actually walk around, and it just felt different to the rest of the city. And we have to engage with these things, whether it's time back to a few hundred years or going back a few thousand years. If there's ancient waterways and causeways, I know there's a project in New York, and it used to be called Beyond Mannahatta, a Wailiki project, and I could completely have said them wrong. But the point was they looked at what was the plants like, what was the landscape like on Manhattan before it was settled, what was the waterways, what the indigenous plants there, and could they learn from that? And Google, for their headquarters in New York, actually tapped into a stream that was underground that they could actually use as a cooling effect for the building by looking at all of this. But now landscapers are actually looking at, can we put in these indigenous plants back again? Would this actually benefit the pollinators, the insects, the animals that are living? We should be bringing back to improve our coastlines and then into the urban parks as well, because the big park in Manhattan is a complete man-made structure. It was built to basically increase land values of all the properties around the side of it. And that's the bad side of supposed regeneration, the social cleansing side, if you want to say it. Because that's a fine line. Does it actually mean regenerating society, or does it mean lining the wallets of developers?
So I have a very interesting story to say about this indigenous knowledge. So we were, most people living in slums build their homes with materials that can be reused. Because two things, because A, they are cheaper, and B, if you get bulldozed, you can't use the bricks and mortar for the next time. But if you have tin sheets and stuff like that, if you do get bulldozed, you can still build the home. So this is something we learned from them, because when we went there and we said, oh, you are getting flooded, we need to help you, we will do this, we will do that. They said, no, we don't want to build homes with brick and mortar. We really help us to deal with the flooding and the leaking, but not with brick and mortar, because they know what works for them. We don't know that, and we cannot force our so-called great knowledge on them. All these things we learned actually from the community people.
Yeah, and you're seeing that in Cape Town as well. One of the partners is based in South Africa, sent me across, here's new examples of what they're trying to do, building these informal settlements. It's like it's a hut, 2-story hut that kind of looks like a small prison complex. It's like, no, because people actually quite like living in these things, but they want access to better services and infrastructure. Those are the things to keep the community and have their neighbours around them, not have a bunch of little clone houses that makes it look like a mini horrible, we call it Barrett developments in the UK, which is one of our mass house builder developments.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak much to the housing process here, other than we need a lot more housing, affordable housing units. But I think, again, one of the projects that we're looking at as a form of urban regeneration through food is how can we create a more circular food system here. We procure $25 million worth of food each year for food insecure Philadelphians, which is a massive amount of money for procurement impact. We currently do it through one company in Brooklyn, which means that we have the impact of generic food that's been put into single-use plastic, 60,000 meals a day. They don't provide things like salad because they don't provide silverware. It's shipped in something like 40 big rigs daily. So we're dealing with particulate and air pollution. More than likely, I would guarantee they're going through low-income communities to get it into the city. And then we provide 3 meals a day to families through our services, various services. And so what we're trying to do, again, kind of getting at that system impact. And I think this goes to the question too of like, how do you go city scale? We're really taking off bite-sized pieces. We know that right now the bottleneck is what we want to do. Sorry, I should preface this. US cities go by this thing called best value in their RFPs. Best value usually means lowest cost. It doesn't mean anything else. It doesn't mean quality of food. It doesn't mean supporting local businesses. It just means what is the lowest bid, we'll take that. We're trying to change that to what does best value mean for the city of Philadelphia? Does it mean supporting local residents? Does it mean improving the health of our residents? Does it mean reducing air pollution? Does it mean reducing plastics that get into the 2 rivers, the Schuylkill and the Delaware that surround the city of Philadelphia? And rather than bite off this whole massive chunk that can be really overwhelming, our first role, because I'm the smart city director, is to use technology to determine can supply meet demand, and can we do a more distributed model? We saw a ton of minority and women-owned businesses in Philadelphia go under or struggle over the past 18 months. And we want to see if it's possible to use this 25 million and keep it in Philadelphia. That's our first bite. The next bite is then to do a pilot. But the goal would be to procure food from the region. So we're not relying on food coming from all over the United States. We would be engaging with the communities to understand culturally what kind of foods they're looking for. If somebody is used to eating curries and whatnot, and they're served ham and cheese sandwich, that might not be, what they're looking for, what they're culturally used to. And so we want to also take that lens of cultural and co-create with the community, again, what the meals need to be within these parameters. And I think that's really exciting to me because there's a lot of opportunities for system-wide impact. But again, it's empowering the individuals. It's hopefully removing some of the stigma of having city-provided food as well by saying, we're creating this, you're supporting a regional ecosystem, but to get kind of at that scale as well of how do you kind of scale it up? It's just taking out that first bite.
So Emily, in that project that you just talked about food, are you guys looking at allowing people to do kitchen gardens or giving them the space or the land to do kitchen gardens where they feel a lot more in control of what they wish to eat every day? Has that been thought about?
Yes, not necessarily as part of this project because the scale of food we need, it would not be met by local gardens, but we do have a very strong program here where we work with the community to provide local gardens. We have STEM programs that are working to help curate that because we know, again, it's a cultural component as well of having that. And then as a landscape architect, that's kind of my heart. One of my reports was on the impact of green space on health and healing. So a lot of these communities are dealing with trauma and green space can really help them work through that. So we have a ton of community gardens here that we support in that way.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's very interesting because I volunteer with Good Food York, but across the region and, it's widespread across many countries. It's a good sustainable food places. But what springs to mind is we go to Excess Food Bank every Wednesday, my wife and I, and it's food that's going to be put in landfill, and supermarkets donate it because they don't want to. So there's a lot of donations going in. There's even a project called the Community Store set up in the city in Barnsley, and they will repackage products from supermarkets if they don't want them to be in their own brand, or it might be stuff that's running off. It's one supermarket, but it's in the other packaging, and this is growing and growing, and then they give it out to various people, and it's a big movement because you're seeing my son's local school, they give out excess food as well. Some of it's for food poverty, some of it's excess food. The downside is our recycling has gone from that to that because a lot of it is packaged. But yeah, you see also people putting in baked goods. You've got Incredible Edible Todmorden, their Incredible Edible movement was started as well. People leave out their windfall apples, pears. There's even a bakery that gives its excess food. I think we talked about this last time. I know it's a small scale thing. There's a bakery in York where he doesn't own his own basically shop, and he doesn't have his own ovens. So what he does is when there's a commercial bakery turns off his ovens on Saturday afternoon, he sticks his bread in, cooks his bread in that, and then takes it to the farmer's market to sell. So there's all these little initiatives about closing the loop and passing on things that are being set up around the world. And it's finding all these case studies and saying, can they be transferred into our locality? So you're not having, like you said, Emily, people want curries and they get ham sandwiches. I don't think anyone really wants a ham and cheese sandwich, though, do they? unless you're in France, and then it's a baguette, though, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
No additional comment from my end. I just wanted to ensure that we were able to get through as many of the questions as possible, possibly even get through all the questions. There was one that came through that I think dovetails quite well into that of what you all three were talking about, especially tied to rapid urban development is something that we clearly know from the global South. In that emphasis on bigger and better and newer, how do we go ahead and counteract some of these elements, especially knowing full well, as you mentioned, Emily, we need more housing. I think Anita knows that question probably better than anybody. How do we actually deal with this? Anybody care to get that one? Go ahead, Anita, please.
Housing is a very, very tricky issue because it deals with a lot of issues related to land ownership. And then there is always, at least in India, and I can only talk about a perspective from India, there is basically a conflict between the state authority, the local authority, and the federal authority. Unlike America, where the states have a huge amount of power and autonomy, Indian states don't have that kind of a power and autonomy. So, for example, the police across all the states works under federal government. So the local state government or the city government has no authority over the police or the security issues. So there's always this conflicting issues related to land. I mean, one of the slums that we work with is located on a federal land, while the people work in the city of Mumbai, but the land belongs to central government or federal government. So when we were doing immunization surveys there, and we found out that the immunization there is only 29%. So we wanted to get some health-related immunization services there. When we took the data to the health commissioner, she said, it's not there. It's not in my map. Well, it was really not in her map because it is on the federal land. So the local municipality doesn't even have it. This is the story of housing. So all the houses which are on that particular slum, which is a 60-year-old slum, it's 20 minutes away from the financial nerve center of the city, but it doesn't exist in anybody's maps. So there is no question of building housing. So government of India comes as and when and bulldozes them out. So this is a really very tricky and pathetic story. Yesterday we had a long webinar on the same thing. And unless we actually have people, we create demands from people, these things, at least in India, they are not going to change. So we really need to work towards that.
Yeah. Having lived in Philadelphia and Charlotte, I know of the big developments that he's talking about. I am not ever very hopeful when I hear of a new development coming in, because I know that it generally means displacement of people who have lived through. Somebody told me one time, and the phrase is always stuck, they've lived through the worst of it, they should benefit from the best of it. And I think the challenge is always that it's the cheaper land that's bought to be built on and have this massive development of what they think should be in that community or what the needs are. Oftentimes don't engage with the community until they're putting a plan before them in plan review, at least in Philadelphia or in the States. And then the communities provided the opportunity to state their concerns, but oftentimes don't have much power in the process. And then they in turn are impacted by the rise in land value resulting from a new development. And they can't afford the taxes, they have to move. or something along that lines. And they're usually the families that have been there for a really long time, have invested in the community, have family members throughout the community, and have this great cultural framework or foundation in that community. So I'm always negative on development, but there are developments out there that can have positive impact by mandates that require them to hire locally, a certain amount of employees to hire locally to benefit from the employment opportunities. There are other tools that the city can leverage to help ensure that there are value or there are benefits going back into the community. But you just often don't see it because there's other factors at play, which is unfortunate.
Yeah.
So we
one
actually.
development. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, go ahead, Richard. Go ahead.
There's one development I know in the UK, and it's in New York. It's called Derwentthorpe, and it was owned by the Joseph Rowntree Housing Trust, and they would not release the land to the developer until the last house is built. So they had control over the development, and it was a environmental development. It built in community gardens, play. It was about people-centric instead of car-centric. It wasn't built for investors, and it works. It's a nice place to walk around. They've got the kind of scale right as well, but you very, very rarely see that. I mean, the last comment there about, the market economy. Yes, we need to build houses for people, not investors.
Sorry, I know Anita, you had something to say, but I want to build on Richard's comment about holding the land until the very end. They did that in Hafen City and Hamburg as well. Yeah. It's not necessarily, there's some issues around affordability of housing in that development that they had to work through, I believe. But it was amazing to me as an American that a government would say, we're holding on to this until you meet our sustainability standards. We're not giving the land over. It's you have to meet our demands. That would never happen in the US because there's such a fear of, well, if we are tough on the developers, they aren't going to want to develop here and they're going to go elsewhere, not realizing the power that the city actually holds. So that is definitely a mechanism to ensure that the development is beneficial.
Okay, great. Thank you. Perhaps if we can move on to some of the other questions, and I'm just going to, please, nobody should be offended in the order that I picked them because this is, I'm trying to match the parts of the conversations that are coming through. There's one from one of our guests here. Life is inherently regenerative. When we talk about urban generation, do we need a paradigm shift that looks at removing structures that prevent regeneration? Perhaps, Richard, that sounds like something up your alley.
Well, the question back to the person, is life inherently regenerative?
Well, no, not only that, the whole question, do we need to actually go ahead and look at removing structures that prevent regeneration?
I mean, you're always going to have changes to cities and how we use them. And you look at the, historic cities and how the buildings have been multifunctional. It depends what you're really meaning about removing structures prevent regeneration as well. I think to regenerate cities, to add in natural stuff, we need to find a way to almost monetize it. And I know this goes against it. We were talking about this before we came on. There's a project we're looking into about how do you get communities to empower themselves? What do we make in the bank these days? Well, we actually lose our money because you get half a percent. You may as well stick it in your mattress and then burn it. But what happens if you put money into a fund for your city that you actually got 2-3% return to build in nature-based solutions, so planting trees, parks, and you're actually getting a return from that. And this is something we're looking into. You get buy-in by private companies, you get buy-in from the city as well. It means an alternative economy going in there, and you could actually then have money that you could then tying into that you could spend just in the local community on local shops. So you're actually using money, it's generating money, you're paying into a fund that greens the city, reduces heat island effects as well. So this is something you could start doing. It's almost a case of not removing the structures, but just completely bypassing them. Because I'm fortunate, I don't have the patience to work for a city. I couldn't imagine doing what Emily's job was doing. I would just bang my head against the wall and run out screaming. I find for my ways looking for the path of least resistance, and so these alternative structures I think we need to do, because we need smart people like Emily in the cities who actually are wanting to do these things, working in the top down and bottom up, but then also getting the communities to find little ways to wiggle around it and actually say this is what we can do. And that goes all the way back to what Anita's saying about tying and empowering people to their voice is going to be heard and make a change.
Which is a great segue to the next question coming from Elsa, who is greeting us from Bogota. the idea would be looking at scalability and the whole idea of urban regeneration tied to obviously something that clearly in a city of 10 million people has to be has to be. Yes, I think, Anita, this question looks like it has your name all over it, if I don't get it wrong here.
Hi, Elsa. Thank you for that question. It's a great question. And I think one of the ways, not the only ways, but one of the ways to scale up local empowerment is essentially, as Richard and Emily was talking about, is to get the decentralized areas doing their own regeneration and then connecting with each other. So like, if we have blocks, so suppose we have blocks, the city is divided into multiple blocks, and then there has to be a connectivity, communications, co-creation and co-learning for scaling up. That's what I think we have seen some of these examples, not so much in Mumbai, but definitely in Ahmedabad. We have seen that kind of a regeneration done through collectivization of various communities and empowering that collectivization.
It reminds me of projects in Barcelona, maybe Emily, you might, Urban Mastices, where the mayor was looking at creating these pockets of land and connecting them together. So you open up design competitions, but you don't have the big developers or big design firms. And the idea is you have the communities or smaller consultancies building for them. The idea you're building in these connections that are going through. It's a bit like if anyone's ever read the work of Frei Otto, who's mainly known as an architect, engineer, but his actual work he did in Occupy and Connecting was about how do indigenous places connect to each other in natural forms as well, biological processes, but this kind of thing of joining them up. How do you bring communities together as well? And that's very much this thing of Anita was drawing on.
Okay, perhaps if I can move on to some of the last questions. This is coming from Damien, speaking about the principles of a new urban paradigm. Can you tell us more? And I'm not quite sure from whom this might be coming from. Does this ring a bell to any of our panelists? Emily, I think you want to say something.
I often talk about like circularity as a new planning paradigm that we have to start incorporating in all aspects of how we operate as cities and not working in silos. So I think, it's just simply, we currently think on a linear economic model, and that drives a lot of our thinking, right? Make, use, waste, and that's our world. I think looking at where we are as a planet, looking at where we are in cities, conversations that are going to be happening in COP26. The U.S. alone, we had massive rains in California. We had massive rains in New York. We're having wildfires out of control. I think we're seeing all of these impacts in our backyard. And I think we need to just be clearer that as we're making decisions as a city, and people in general, but I'm going to speak from the perspective of cities. Like if we're procuring new cars for our city fleet of 4,500 vehicles, why are we not procuring electric vehicles? Why are we still procuring internal combustion engines when the market is very clearly pointing that we are headed to electric vehicles? We need to, right? Why are we not investing more in public transportation? Why are we working to expand highways to more lanes when we know that transportation was one of the biggest emitters of greenhouse gas emissions in our planet? So these are all things that we need to be having mechanisms in place to create this overall paradigm shift to thinking through the systems and ways that we can capture, I keep on going back to cars because it's top of mind right now with the bill coming out of the government around infrastructure, and electrification will hopefully be a big component because it has such an impact on our cities. But if we're looking to get electric cars, how can we use the batteries then when they're sitting vacant as backup to our grid? Like all of these things need to start happening in one big conversation versus these disparate conversations that we're having in silos, which is how we've gotten to where we're at, in my opinion. So that's kind of what I meant by an overarching planning principle or paradigm shift.
Okay, great. Sorry, Richard,
Tying in-
please go ahead.
Yeah, it's breaking up this into, can we get towards circularity? No, but can we get close? Yes. And start tying things in, like linking into the planetary boundaries work. It's very much looking at donut economics and various other models and bringing that together. So you're tying in the social aspects as well. I don't think the donut economics action lab, what they're doing with cities, are perfect. I think some of the things are far too simplified down, but I think you can take the basics from it and start breaking it into, start with the circularity, how that links into the human side of things as well, because we quite often forget about the social aspects of circularity and sustainability, because it's not sustainability if you don't include the social aspect. So it's building all these in and then understanding what connecting all these dots up and build a systems model to understand how can we impact change in our cities.
Well, sorry. Oh,
no, go ahead. Please
I was
go
just
ahead.
going to add, to Richard's point about the social side of things. I think oftentimes, at least in the U.S., sustainability is very political, right? It's coal versus renewable energy. We even have it like it's a bipartisan issue. And I think all of us are on here because we're very passionate about things like circularity. And so when I was working, and if we're trying to get stuff around circularity going, I've had a lot of success around the economic side of it, about the job creation, because all of our cities are dealing with the need to create jobs. I just kind of reframing the conversation to your audience, I think, is also something that's important to share. In Charlotte, when we got the Circular Charlotte strategy done, it was largely because it was reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which they were on the line for because they committed to a variety of things. But it was also about economic mobility. Circularity can create opportunities for returning citizens, for underskilled, underemployed, for hard to employ individuals that would otherwise not have these opportunities, because it creates new economic revenue streams. And oh, by the way, it helps the environment, right? It's kind of that, like, we don't always have to push the sustainability side of things to get the impact that we want. And I think that that's important to look at as well.
Right, and certainly we are always looking to come up with some sort of commonality, some sort of roadmap, not necessarily relying upon those individuals who will get us out of the darkness in a few weeks in Glasgow, but rather take things into our own hands. And I think that there's a great source for us to actually go ahead and review some of these elements, and this would all be tied to this concept of a new urban paradigm, looking at those elements that we really need within these cities. I'd like to just go ahead and quickly share this information with our audience right now. Understanding that, of course, that it has to be socially inclusive. That was something that was mentioned quite often in our conversations today. Affordability, we talked specifically tied to housing. Accessible and equitable. Equity was another big subject that we talked about. Economically vibrant and inclusive is another point that we need to make sure is part of our mix. Collectively managed and democratically governed, which, of course, if we're looking at it from an empowerment perspective, also very important. Cohesive territorial development, which basically means that we are looking to make sure that the whole area of what we're covering is actually part of our conversations. Regenerative and resilience. That is one that we've mentioned quite a bit of. Shared identities and sense of place. Well-planned, walkable, and transit-friendly. I don't think we had an opportunity to go through that, but perhaps, Aki, you can go ahead and correct me on that. Safe, healthy, promotes well-being, and then learns and innovates, which I think is another point that I think is definitely worth talking about. Aki, anything that you perhaps would like to go ahead and add to that mix?
No, I mean, I think, so much has been said already. I'd really encourage people to, look at this, whether they're an urban planner or a citizen or, running a business or whatever their role is in this city environment. Are you ticking these boxes? I think that's, we've had plenty of examples of positive solutions and positive stories, and I always like to have solutions. But I think we've also had some warning signs. So take this away, make this your cheat sheet.